Okay, let's start. This is the LaRouche Pack Saturday evening class, as I said, but some of you weren't here. This is Tony Pappert speaking to you from Michigan. And with me is Bruce Director speaking from Virginia. Bruce, and most of you, or those of you who have joined us in the past probably know Bruce. He's a longtime leader of the Lyndon LaRouche movement and one who has for decades, and one who has worked directly with Mr. LaRouche on some important scientific topics, among other things. So tonight we're going to be discussing the Federal Reserve. Bruce has written about that. You can find his work on our website, larouchepack.com. And so let me just ask Bruce first, as we hinted at this in the emailed announcement for this class, briefly, the London market had a near-death experience about 10 days ago. The Bank of England reversed policy and rushed in with a $50 billion or 50 billion pound purchase of long-term government bonds to avert disaster. The citizens rightly sense that a major turn into an economic and financial catastrophe is lurking around the corner. And the first question is, can the Fed prevent this, and why not? So maybe we could start there.
Well, it's a good question. I think more and more people are doubting they can. Part of that is because of the structural problem with what the Fed is and what it's become over its history, but especially in the last 20 years or so, where the Fed has basically usurped. It always had more power than it needed, than it should have. It's got a structural problem in that it's a central bank as opposed to a national bank. And we can discuss that more, as we go along. This particular is about that. But since especially the 1997 period, when the LTCM, which was a very small hedge fund, blew out and almost crashed the global financial system, and Greenspan came in and forced a bailout of LTCM. And then after the dot-com bubble, and especially after the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed has sort of taken on the role of being the bailer out of last resort, to coin a term which probably is not in proper English, in which they've just been decided that they would, print money and bail out every financial institution and basically make free money available. So we've had pretty much unbroken for the last 15 years, but even before that, a policy of basically free money. And that free money has not been backed up by any real production. There have been things that have happened, like globalization and the growth of the Chinese economy and offshoring and that kind of thing, which have tended to mask the real problem. But then you had the situation with the COVID, where the Fed in 2 years printed more money and exploded their balance sheet in 2 years, more than they had in 200 years before that. So now you're the era of free money has come to an end. Even Jamie Dimon, in an interview he gave last week, said, I think we're going to look back on it and realize that this was free money was a colossal failure. Of course, this is ironically the policy that Ben Bernanke just last week won the Nobel Prize in economics for, not for what he did as head of the Fed, but for a research study he did when he was 30 years old back at Princeton, which we ridiculed at the time, back in the early 80s, where he got the adopted or was given the nickname Helicopter Ben because he wrote a research paper in which he said, if there's ever another financial crisis like the Great Depression, like the 1929 crash, if he were in a position of power, he would just fly over countries and throw money out of helicopters, and that would solve the crisis. So when he got in a position of power, he put that into action, collapsed the world economy, created the crisis we're in right now, and subsequently he got a Nobel Peace Prize for his, I guess, his excellence at destroying the financial system and the economies of the world.
So you were saying, yeah, the structural reasons that they can't do anything significant. More you want to say about that?
Well, the problem is that what the Fed, the way it's set up, all the Fed can do is try and adjust the money supply, the amount of the cost of money, basically, and by raising interest rates. The other thing they're trying to do is they're trying to reduce their balance sheet, because during the both during the financial crisis and also in the last since the pandemic, the Fed started doing something they've never really done before, ever, which is to purchase government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. So I think the Fed's balance sheet was less than $1 trillion in 2007, and now it's something like $9 trillion. It was like $7 trillion or $6 trillion when the pandemic started, and in 2 years they expanded it by $3 trillion. My numbers may be a little off, but it's in that range. And so now they're trying to make money cost more by raising interest rates. But when you raise interest rates and also reducing the amount of money available in the system by shrinking their balance sheets. But when you do that, what you do is you increase the cost of actually doing productive activity. Everybody knows the effect of raising interest rates. You know, cars, I think the car cost of buying a car on credit, which most people have to do because the price of a new car is now well over $40,000, the average price. And at a 7 or 8% interest rate for a car loan, you're talking about a monthly payment of $1,000 a month for 7 years. I mean, it used to be a 7-year car loan didn't exist. It was only in the last, I think, 15 or 20 years that you had 4 or 5-year car loans. It used to be car loan was 2 years. Now 7 years, and it's $1,000 a month to pay off that car loan. Businesses that want to expand or borrow money to invest, you know, that costs more. So, and credit cards, which are usually interest rate adjustable, they go up. So everybody's cost goes up. So you're talking about trying to stop inflation by raising interest rates. You're actually increasing the cost of goods and services just by doing that. And at the same time, the Fed is doing that, trying to tighten the money supply. The Biden government and the Congress are issuing money by you know, fiat. Biden canceled student loans. That's what's anywhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion. They're pledging as much money as Ukraine wants. So now we're financing two governments, our government and the government in Ukraine. So the government and the infrastructure bill, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, all these things. So the federal government doesn't have the money, as everybody knows. We're running a deficit, and therefore the government has to issue bonds, has to borrow money, but nobody's buying those bonds except the Federal Reserve. So while on the one hand, the Federal Reserve is trying to reduce the amount of bonds they're holding. On the other hand, the government is spending money that with no economic value or economic intention whatsoever. I'm talking about the real economy. And the Federal Reserve, and in order to finance that, they have to basically go to the Federal Reserve, who prints money at the same time they're trying to shut down the money. So that's why the problem we have in our economy cannot be solved by the methods the Federal Reserve is doing. On the one hand, they do have to get away from this free money policy, but on the other hand, simply doing that and raising interest rates, thinking that you're going to, as they say, crush demand, is actually not working. And inflation's not going to come down, and it isn't coming down, as we saw from the latest figures that came out last week.
Well, why do you think Americans put up with it? Do you want to address that? I mean, we've had it now over, it's been 109 years we've had the Federal Reserve, and frankly, it's never done us any good, except, it was some subconditional help to the Roosevelt administration because he put a buddy in at the head of it. But aside from that, it's been poisonous. And I mean, the thing where the Fed was supposedly created to bring stability to the system, and it's created, and what, 13, 14 years later, we've plunged into a Great Depression, which we didn't get out of for a decade.
Well, this issue of who controls our money and what is the money, how the money of the country is generated, has been, believe it or not, the main political issue throughout most of American history.
Yeah, well said.
And Bob Ingram has talked about this in a lot of his writings and some of his classes, but it was clearly an issue in the Washington administration, the very first administration, because and this is the policy that led to Hamilton issuing his 3 reports on report on manufacturers, public credit, and the National Bank. And in the Constitutional Convention, it was discussed and agreed that, unlike any other country in the world, they established that the Congress would have the authority to coin money and determine the value thereof. So it was a very bold idea that the political representatives of the people should have the power to do what's needed to benefit the people. Now, this was different than, say, the British economy, in which you had a kind of independence of the financial system. And in fact, the bankers pretty much controlled the monarchy. Every time the king, and this was true throughout all of Europe, anytime a monarch wanted to go to war, they had to sit down with a bunch of bankers, and the bankers would decide whether they'd loan them the money or not. Every once in a while, a monarch would feel his oats and cancel the debt, and the bankers would go bankrupt, but it didn't establish, since it was a monarchy and not a republic, it didn't lead to any permanent changes. So that's what Hamilton intended, and Washington put this into practice. And over the course of American history, this has been the fight. And it's the same argument you hear today, without going through a long historical discussion, but it's the same argument you hear today about the so-called independence of the Fed. This is like a mantra, which is pretty funny, because the Fed is not independent of the government. It's a branch of the government. And although its stock is owned by the member banks, not by the government, so it's not a national bank. But the idea that you would put a bunch of bankers in, that you're somehow, the economy is under better stewardship if you have a bunch of bankers stewarding our money, rather than the elected representatives who are responsible to the people and being in charge. and this really, as I say, it's been the fight. It was the intention of the founding fathers in the Constitution. And every time in our history that America has faced a crisis, it's gotten through that crisis because the government has taken over the powers and authority to control the money. Now, let's demystify money for a second. As Lyndon LaRouche always used to say, money is an idiot. Money has no intrinsic value. I don't care whether it's backed by gold, silver, Bitcoin, or any other, or oil, or commodities, or anything like that. Money has no intrinsic value. It is its function. It has its value is a function of the productivity of the economy. And we can get into in the Q&A or some point, more how that sort of developed over the years. But when the United States has gotten into a crisis, it's gotten out of those crises by the government taking the power that it is given by the Constitution, controlling the money, as Lincoln did with the greenbacks, or as you mentioned, Roosevelt did under the war mobilization period in particular, and issued credit on the through the government for the productive capacity, to expand the productive capacity of the country. And that credit became the money. Now, for most of our history, you didn't have that. In fact, we didn't even have a national currency until the greenbacks, and after Lincoln was assassinated, that ceased to exist. And the currency was basically issued by local banks. People would use whatever notes a bank would issue to do their business. This created, huge depressions in 1873 and 1904 and so forth. And there was a movement in the country saying we have to get back to a kind of national bank. And the bankers at first were very opposed to this, but once they realized this was going to go through, they decided, well, if there's going to be a central bank, we're going to control it. And they arranged to set up the Fed according to the structure that it is and give it this so-called independence. And as you pointed out, the Fed has done absolutely nothing to stabilize the economy. It's been responsible for every single financial crisis we've had. And then you get economists like Bernanke, who get paid by academic institutions to write academic papers about how the last financial crisis was caused by mistakes of the Fed. They propose new mistakes, which are then carried out when the Fed at the next crisis, and then they write economic papers about how the mistakes that they had proposed earlier didn't work. It's like J.P. Morgan. I mean, Jamie Dimon, the head of the biggest bank in the United States, probably the biggest bank in the world, saying, I guess in hindsight, this zero interest rate policy will be a colossal failure. So I think the American people are waking up to this in terms of your question about why do they put up with this, but there really is a lot of stupidity, to put it simply, on the part of the elected officials, the business leaders, economists, so-called economists, and politicians. Politicians don't want to accept the responsibility for making economic policy. The people don't hold the politicians accountable, and they slough it all off onto this temple on Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., and say, the geniuses inside that temple will handle everything for us. And they clearly have shown that they're not geniuses, that's for sure.
And
there has to be a change in politics, and I think just to sum it up,
go ahead.
There has to be a change in politics, and I think that's the issue in this election. In fact, I think it was the issue in the 2016 election as well, that the uprising you saw in 2016, which brought Trump into the White House, but also, even ripped up the Democratic Party, because Sanders, who is pretty much a sellout, but nevertheless ran a populist campaign. And his support, was in reaction to the bailouts of the Obama years. And, Obama's presidency was the very same thing. We're smart people. We're the experts. We have the degrees. We're going to handle everything. It may be unfair, but everything will work out fine in the end. And it didn't. So people revolted. They put Trump in there. And that turmoil was obviously the issue in the 2020 election. It's the issue now in this election in 2022, and it will be the issue in 2024. And it's going to be resolved. It will only be resolved by restoring the Hamiltonian idea of economics, of what our money is.
And as I said, or as we hinted in the email that went out, I mean, Americans have been systematically disoriented and confused by British economic fakery, since, well, certainly for over 200 years now, at least. I cited John Maynard Keynes. I mean, Keynes was nothing but an America handler. He was used to try to control the United States, and this artificial reputation that he was a great economist was created for nothing but that purpose. If you look at the history, I mean, he was the guy the British sent over when they needed a huge loan after World War II, when they were bankrupt. He was the guy, or in World War II, during World War II, he was the guy who was sent over here to the Bretton Woods conference so that the Bretton Woods system of Franklin Roosevelt is falsely dubbed in our academic economics, which is fraudulent, as being a Keynesian system, when it wasn't. Keynes was in the Bretton Woods Hotel when the thing was being put together, but he had just had a heart attack. His wife wouldn't let him out of his room. He had nothing to do. His proposals were junked. His proposal was for a world currency called the Bank Corps. Roosevelt administration would have nothing to do with it. The purpose of it was to preserve the British Empire exploitative arrangements. His proposal was for a World Trade Organization. That was rejected by the United States. It was only slipped in decades later. So he had nothing to do with it. He had nothing to do with Bretton Woods. It's a complete fraud. He was sent over here to meet with Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt hadn't heard of him because at that point, I guess his artificial reputation hadn't been blown up so big. So he was smuggled into Roosevelt's office. Roosevelt and he talked for half an hour, I can't remember which. And when he left, Roosevelt asked the staffer, what was that? Who was that man? She said, oh, he's Keynes, the famous economist. And Roosevelt said, well, I didn't think he was an economist. I thought he was a mathematician. He did nothing but babble numbers.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing you're dealing with, and Keynes is on the liberal side, and as you mentioned in your email, you have the Milton Friedman, von Mises people on the right side who say, well, if you just get the government out of it and let the private sector determine the price of money and credit and so forth, then everything will work out fine. But there's no evidence that's true, and every time it's been tried, it led to a complete disaster. Because human beings, the economy is the economy of human beings, and the economy is organized not around money, but around future goals, future ideas. Where do we want humanity to be in the next generation or two? And you organize the present around your concept of the future. And therefore you structure your financial system and your financial arrangements to bring about that future. And whether it's winning a war like the Civil War, but Lincoln prosecuted the Civil War with the idea in mind of the emergence of America after the Civil War would be a continental power a manufacturing and industrial power. And so while the war was being prosecuted, he instituted things like the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad, and so forth. So he was working for a future not at Appomattox, but the future of continental industrial power. The same thing with Roosevelt during World War II. The future was not defeating the Nazis in Imperial Japan. The future was a world without empire, in which the economic methods that Roosevelt had employed and the United States had used to get ourselves out of an economic disaster, physical economic disaster in the Depression, and go into the war mobilization, could be made available and applied worldwide to a world without empires. And that's where we have to look at now. This is something LaRouche has pointed out. So that's why the control of the financial system and policy has to be governed by the American people through their elected representatives. And I think this political turmoil we have right now is over the fight that Americans want to get control of their government back, which they have not. And they've been impotent. And now they're saying, we don't, that's killed us. Let's end that.
Absolutely. I mean, I was just reading a very good discussion of the credit principle, the American credit principle, with which the Federal Reserve has to be replaced as soon as possible. And I can give this, I think I can get this reference to people if people want to read it, but it was Lyndon LaRouche. He said, what is credit? It's based in the fact that we're not animals. We do not simply die, as Edgar Allan Poe said, that something of us remains for years and for generations, which is our purpose for having lived. And that this is the function of credit, carrying forward the purpose from long-term credit, carrying forward the purpose from generation to generation, as in the Lincoln administration's launching the process of integrating the United States, by rail as a continental, an integrated continental nation, which lasts for generations and then changed in its form again in the 20th century, and it continues. This is the function of long-term credit, the difference of man from the animal. And the fact, as I said, that we don't simply die. There's something that bridges, all this is what LaRouche said, there's something that bridges from the individual who has died to the next, to the next, to the next in a chain. And this is the function of long-term credit. It's not a function of money, but it's a function of the productivity of labor in the largest sense. And that can be looked at in one approximation as energy flux density. Energy flux density per person per square kilometer. This is a lawful correspondence, or it's an expression for the productivity of labor. And this is the principle of credit, the American system of credit, not money and not exchange of money and not value of money. All of those things are merely tools.
Yes, absolutely.
Want to say anything else about it? I mean, there's other aspects, but maybe we'll go at some time soon into questions.
Well, I mean, I think you hit on, this is the hardest thing for people to understand, is that, I mean, there's a lot of, as LaRouche emphasized many times, and other people are coming to this realization, that you have to have a stable monetary system. It is, you can't let the price of money and the value of money be float willy-nilly, depending on whatever power various financial powers might have on it. And that was the idea behind Bretton Woods. Now, there's a myth that Bretton Woods was a gold-backed system. It wasn't a gold-backed system. It was a system that was based on really the productive power of the United States and the potential of other countries to adopt those kinds of policies and then use those and that would increase their productivity. And therefore, you would have a set of international relationships between nations that their currencies would remain relatively stable to one another so that you could facilitate long-term trade. And that's really
investment.
in long-term investment. And that's really an important concept because, if you look at especially over the last 40 years since the collapse of Bretton Woods, but on an accelerated level in the last 25 or 30 years, the time frame for investment has decreased to milliseconds for the
Exactly.
large bulk of investment which is going around the world. I mean, it's well known. The Bank for International Settlements just released a report that there's $600 trillion in derivatives out there. And most of this is completely unknown because it's not even in banks. In the 2008 crisis, a lot of banks held these exotic credit mechanisms like the collateralized debt obligations and whatever else they call these crazy things. But now they have these $600 trillion of these, and 96% of that $600 trillion of derivatives contracts are for interest rates and for foreign exchange, currency values. $600 trillion, right? Which is far greater than the amount of money that's circulates in the actual economy of every country on earth. It's I don't know, 100 times of that, right? And what I mean by these derivatives contracts is like what just happened in England, where the pension funds blew up. Now the pension funds, these pension funds in Britain are very much like the old pension funds used to be in the United States, where you work at a company, you pay into the pension fund, the company invests that money, and then at a certain point, when people retire, they draw a check, a monthly check, kind of like Social Security, except it was a private pension fund. But unlike Social Security, it can't be financed by printing money. It can only be financed by either the company coming up with more money to cover the benefits, or the investments providing enough money to cover these investments. Now, over the last 15 years, since the interest rates have been very low, the pension funds, in order to get enough of a return on their investment to pay the beneficiaries that they're owed, the pension funds have been investing in riskier and riskier investments, short-term investments. So they have long-term liabilities, but they're paying for them with short-term investments. So in order to protect themselves, the government encouraged them to buy these derivatives, which were based on interest rates. So that if the interest rates goes, it was sort of like an insurance policy. If the interest rates, you pay a certain fee, the interest rates go up, you then can use the derivatives contract to roll over your investments into the higher interest rates, or to cover your losses if you're betting on the long thing, something like that, right? And when you have these rapid fluctuations like what's happened in the last few months, these derivatives contracts require more and more collateral. So the pension funds were ordered to come up with more money, and they had a squeeze on them, and boom, they went broke. So on the one hand, the Bank of England was saying they were going to tighten money supply, and on the other hand, they had to pump a huge amount of money, otherwise they would keep the pension funds from blowing up. So how is $600 trillion in short-term derivatives, which can go bust at any moment, anywhere? Another thing Jamie Dimon said this week is that you can expect more surprises, because during the 2008 financial crisis, much of this was centered in banks and investment houses. After the 2008 crisis, the new financial regulations pushed a lot of this kind of investment off into the so-called shadow banking system, which right now is much bigger than the banking system. So people say, well, the banks are in much better shape than they were in 2008, so we're not going to have a financial crisis. But the shadow banking system is much bigger. And if a crisis blows out there, even though from a legal standpoint, the Federal Reserve and the government are not responsible for the shadow banking system, what are you going to do if they blow out? Well, the Bank of England decided they would cover the losses. So you've got to, this thing has to just be popped. There's no painless way to do it. In fact, there's only a painful way to do it. And create the conditions by which you get long-term investment. Anything that, any economic activity that accomplishes the results that you just described, that Lyndon LaRouche described, long-term investment over future generations, 50 years, 100 years, 25 years, has to be, even 10 years, has to be based on a relatively, first of all, a stable currency, a stable interest rate, and a relatively low interest rate that people can recoup their investment over when the physical economic activity is accomplished, such as building a factory or building a nuclear power plant or whatever type of large-scale project you want to do, building a bridge tunnel across the Bering Strait or something like that, right? These are long-term investments. And those are the investments which have to be given favor. And this short-term investment has to be dried up and basically eliminated.
Yes, and and you know, just to carry on where you left off, or from what you said, yeah, we have some questions. We have some questions, so we should move to questions in a minute. But just to carry on directly from what you said, I mean, people say the Bretton Woods system was a gold-backed system. It wasn't. The system, as Bruce was saying, the system is backed by the long-term investments. The system is backed by the long-term investments and the long-term agreements for raw materials purchases. This is what Lynn says in a book, right, which is read. But it's backed by the long-term investments and long-term agreements for raw materials. This is what Russia has insisted on, that they want to sell their natural resources based on long-term agreements, not the ever-fluctuating spot market. So that is the backing for currencies under Bretton Woods is real value, real production, which is programmed and scheduled and known decades in advance through long-term investments and long-term contracts. And yeah, go ahead.
No, I just want to say just a point that people probably are not aware of, but you know, under Bretton Woods, that was, for example, in the oil market, 90%, 95% of the oil that was traded in the world was on long-term contracts, 5-year, 10-year contracts. It is, the price was set 5 years, 10 years in advance. So businesses that were buying oil knew what the price of the oil they were buying was going to be over a long period of time, so they could then know to make those kinds of investments. And when the Bretton Woods system collapsed, then you had the provoked 1973 war, which led to basically the rise of OPEC. And all those long-term contracts ended. And the price of oil became set by the price on the spot market. That is, the spot market, which existed largely in Amsterdam or Rotterdam, was a place where if you had a 10-year contract and 1 year you ended up with too much oil, you could go to this spot market and sell your surplus. If you ended up with not enough oil, you could go to that spot market and cover your shortfall. But that was only 5% of the market. Everything else was set on these long-term contracts. Starting after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, you had a shift where it went the other way. And because all oil traded in the world was traded in dollars, not in local currencies, the dollar then, the value of the dollar in effect became set by the price of oil. And the price of oil was not being determined by a physical economic parameter. That is, how much does it cost to produce a barrel of oil? How much do you have to sell it for in order to be able to make a profit and to have enough for reinvestment and so on and so forth? But the price of oil was based on whatever speculators could speculate the price to be on the Rotterdam spot market. And that determined the value of the dollar. So it took it completely out of the hands of the United States government and the people and put it into the hands of international financial speculators, as Kissinger intended. And you ended up with that was pretty much the beginning of this whole deneutering of governments and the creation of an international financial cartel run out of London, which determined the value of the currencies. And that just completely disrupted the possibility for long-term investment. It stuck around to a certain degree out of requirements for maintaining a large defense industry during the Cold War. So there was a necessity to maintain long-term investments in certain things that were either directly related to defense or secondarily related to a defense. But then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had, remember, the talk about the peace dividend and globalization, and then that whole thing went completely crazy, and we've had nothing but one financial collapse after another since then.
Yeah, very well said. So I think we have people who have called in to ask questions, and why don't we begin to do that?